Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Hannibal by Thomas Harris. Now, Hannibal was published in 1999, and this is the third book of Thomas Harris's crime drama series that is now known as the Hannibal Lecter series. The reason I say it's now known is because the character of Hannibal Lecter was never meant to be the main character of this series. In the first book, Red Dragon, which was published in 1981, Lecter was really only a minor character in that novel, and Thomas Harris had no intention of ever bringing the character back in any of his later novels. And then in 1988, Thomas Harris wrote a sequel to Red Dragon titled The Silence of the Lambs, and when he wrote that novel, not only did he bring Lecter back, but he also made Lecter one of the main characters of the story, and gave Lecter a much more important role to play in that story. And in this book, Hannibal Lecter is the main character. Now, all the books in this series have also been made into movies. The first book, Red Dragon, was made into a movie in 1986 titled Manhunter. The second book, The Silence of the Lambs, was made into a movie of the same name in 1991. And this book was also made into a movie 2 years after it was published, and the movie was directed by Ridley Scott, and this edition of the book I have is actually the movie tie-in edition. Oh, and I forgot to mention that there was also a 2002 adaptation of the first book, Red Dragon. Just watch Manhunter instead, or better yet, read the book. A few years after this novel, Thomas Harris would follow this up with a prequel novel titled Hannibal Rising, which was published in 2006 and was made into a movie of the same name in 2007. And recently you had the 3-season TV series Hannibal, which was based on the entire Hannibal Lecter book series, and it combined elements and characters from all of the books all into one show. Now, this book is actually kind of polarizing among fans of the series. Some people love it and some people really hate it. I personally love the book, but I can understand why this book was so polarizing. Even though I love the book, I can completely understand why a person would absolutely hate this novel. Now, even though I do really like this book, there are a few things here and there that I wish Thomas Harris would have done a little differently, especially because this was meant to be the final book in the series. There are a few things that I wish he did a little differently that I'll address later on in this review. Now, the plot of Hannibal is it's set 7 years after the events of The Silence of the Lambs, and it follows the character of Clarice Starling, who was the primary protagonist of The Silence of the Lambs. So, in the beginning of the novel, Clarice is leading this drug raid, and she ends up shooting and killing a suspect because the suspect was shooting at her and her colleagues, but it turns out this suspect was also holding a child, and the media catches wind of this, and they blow it out of proportion, and Clarice ends up finding herself in a world of shit because of this. So, because of all this, her reputation ends up getting ruined, and the only one who really seems to have her back is Jack Crawford. Now, in the previous novel, The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal managed to escape police custody, so in this book you realize that Hannibal is still at large, and because of what's happening to Clarice, Hannibal ends up sending her a letter of sympathy, and basically the FBI now tasks her with trying to track down Hannibal Lecter as sort of a way for her to redeem herself. So, the basic plotline of the novel is Clarice is now trying to track down Hannibal Lecter, who you find out in the book is actually living in Florence under an assumed name, but it turns out that she's not the only one looking for Hannibal. It turns out that one of Lecter's victims, who actually survived, a man named Mason Verger, is looking for Lecter. Mason Verger was a patient of Lecter's back when Hannibal Lecter was a psychiatrist, back before Will Graham captured Lecter before the events of the first novel. Basically, Mason Verger was a patient of Lecter's who was actually a wealthy child molester, and Lecter fed him these hallucinogenic drugs and actually convinced him to cut off his own face, and then he also paralyzed him. So now Mason Verger is in a wheelchair and his face is all fucked up, and basically he wants revenge on Lecter for what Lecter did to him. He wants to capture Hannibal Lecter and have him tortured to death. So basically, in the story, Clarice eventually finds out about what Verger is up to, and she tries to stop this because even though Lecter is a serial killer and she wants to see him brought to justice, she also doesn't want to see him die the horrible death that Verger has planned for him. And Clarice tries to stop this, but unfortunately, Verger also has members of the FBI working for him. Now, as I mentioned before, I actually really liked Hannibal. Now, I know a lot of people do not like this book, and I get it. Like, I could get why a person would not like this novel, especially the ending of the book, but I personally liked it, and I can't say I liked it as much as the first two books, but I still really enjoyed this novel. And one of the things I really do love about this novel is the book very much touches on the theme of corruption, because in the novel you see this corruption within the FBI. Like, the FBI is trying to use Clarice as a scapegoat for this botched drug raid that you see happen in the beginning of the novel, and also the fact that members of the FBI are in Mason Verger's pocket, pretty much. Like, you see all this corruption within the FBI, and also the character of Mason Verger himself. You get the idea that it's just the whole system that allows somebody like Mason Verger to get away with the things he does, because Verger comes from a very wealthy family who owns this meatpacking industry, and also his family is politically connected, so that's really what allows him to get away with all these despicable crimes. So corruption is a major theme within this novel, and in this book you just feel so sorry for the character of Clarice, because you realize she's a good FBI agent, yet she's being treated so unfairly by the FBI, and you see the corruption within the FBI really weighing down on her. And Clarice has a very complex relationship with the character of Hannibal Lecter. Like, I would almost argue that it's one of the most complex hero-slash-villain relationships in modern literature. Even though in this book, Lecter is really not the villain of this novel. Like, he's really more of an anti-hero in this story. Really, the character of Mason Verger is the main villain of the novel. Lecter is much more of an anti-hero, and in this book you actually do feel some sympathy for Lecter. Some. He's still a bad guy, like, he's a despicable human being, but I would argue that Verger is a much worse person than Lecter, because Verger is also a child molester, and, like, I'm sorry, I would forgive a serial killer before I forgive a child molester. I mean, don't get me wrong, Hannibal Lecter, he's still a bad guy, but once again, in this novel, he's much more of an anti-hero, whereas Verger is much more of the villain. And I would say in this novel, Clarice and Hannibal are almost like dual protagonists within the story. Now, in this book, some of Hannibal Lecter's backstory is also explained, which I know a lot of people did not like that, because they felt like it kind of ruined the mystique of the character, and to an extent, I can understand that, that, but I don't know, for some reason it worked for me, and I actually liked the backstory that they gave for Lecter in this novel, and Lecter actually does have a very tragic backstory, and his backstory is also expanded upon in the fourth Hannibal Lecter novel, which was titled Hannibal Rising. And once again, I would argue that Mason Verger is really the main antagonist of this novel, and Verger is such a scumbag. Mason Verger, he's a character who you're supposed to feel both sympathy and disgust for, but personally, I just felt disgust for this character. And maybe that's because he is a child molester, but also you find out about all the stuff he does to his sister, and he's just a despicable human being, and in a lot of ways, I feel like the fact that Lecter didn't kill him almost shows that Lecter, in his own fucked up way, has some morals, because maybe Lecter felt like death would be too easy for somebody like Mason Verger. Now, one reason why a lot of people did not like this book is the ending, and I'm just going to say right off the bat that I can completely understand why a person would totally hate the ending of this book, but I loved the ending of this book, and I loved it mainly because it was just so brutally nihilistic, and I felt like the entire novel was almost oppressively nihilistic, and I felt like the ending just fit the nihilistic feel of the entire novel. Also, I felt like this novel, in a lot of ways, was sort of a tragedy, and I felt like the ending really fit the tragic feel of the entire novel. And also, the ending of this book just shows how manipulative Hannibal Lecter really is, and even though Lecter is sort of an anti-hero in this story, he's still a bad guy, and the ending really does show how evil Hannibal really is. And once again, I loved the ending, but I can totally understand why a person would absolutely despise this ending. Now, even though I do like this book, one thing that I do wish Thomas Harris would have done is, I wish he would have brought the character of Will Graham back. Will Graham was the main character of Red Dragon, and he was the one who originally captured Hannibal Lecter, and I think that would have been really cool if Thomas Harris would bring this character back, and it would have been really cool to see Clarice and Will Graham working together to try to track down Hannibal Lecter. That would have been awesome, but unfortunately he didn't do that, and I wish he would have at least given the character of Will Graham a mention in this novel, but from what I remember, I don't even remember the character of Will Graham even being mentioned in this book at all. Now, as I mentioned before, this book was also made into a movie of the same name in 2001, which was directed by Ridley Scott. Now, I like the movie Hannibal. It does change a lot from the book, but I do like the movie. I don't like it as much as Manhunter or The Silence of the Lambs, but I still think it's a pretty good movie. I know a lot of people don't like that one, but I enjoy it. Now, as I mentioned before, recently you had the show Hannibal, which was loosely based on all of the books, and the character of Mason Verger from this book, as well as his sister, were incorporated into the TV show eventually, and the third season of Hannibal loosely adapted some of the events from this book. So yeah, that's my review on Hannibal by Thomas Harris, and bye.